For our first set of watercolor worksheets, we're going to do this half sheet that is based on watercolor and brush practice. We did a little bit of that last semester, but now we're bringing it back as a review for those of you who were here last semester. But we're adding a little bit more to that too, so you're developing beyond what skills you should have already created at the first semester. The objectives are to develop your painting skills with watercolors and your brush control. This is all about neatness and how to do the things correctly. So make sure you read the directions, follow the objectives, get them done, and under each of these boxes is a label that you achieve for its objective. So here's what we're doing. We're creating hard edges along the outer edges of the object, so that it goes right up to the black outline, but not outside of it. So leaves no white paper between it and the black outline, but the paint doesn't go outside of the black outline or even on top of it. The second objective is to create even color coverage with your watercolors, so that the pigment looks like it's nice and evenly applied, and that there isn't white paper showing through unless it's for a tint of that color. And we'll explain that as we go. So after you've labeled it with your name and period, make sure you saturate the color that you want to use. I would like you to use any color you choose for the entire page, just one color, but please don't use yellow or black. Black is next to the brown. Yellow's right in the middle of the tray. This looks like black if you're not too on it. So, but it's actually purple or violet. It's a dark color. The yellow is the lightest color in your palette, and violet or purple is the darkest, and black is a neutral, so it's not one of the spectrum colors. Okay, so now we saturate the color as much as possible. I'm going to go ahead and do orange. It's dark enough that I can see it. Now, all of a sudden, I realize, hey, I didn't clean out my brush really well last time I did this. So now I have to clean that out and get it usable so it's not impure. So rather than, I think I can do this real quick. Rather than take a lot of time and waste the medium, I'm just going to go with whatever happens in there. Saturate it really well. Remember, you have one side to clean your brush and one side to pick up clean water in the water container. So remember that this water container needs to be full up to this line. Between this one needs to be full and this one needs to be full. You clean your brush here, you get clean water for mixing with your watercolors in the other one. So you want to make a nice thick paste out of this, and you want to have enough that you don't run out before you're finished with the work. And it should be thick enough that it looks opaque when you go on the paper here. We're doing wet on dry for this row, where you don't have water on the paper first. You just take the pigment that has been saturated with water, and you paint it down. So as this sheet shows you, read this sheet too, please. As this sheet shows you, it's easiest to create hard edges if you can see where the brush is going, so pull it toward yourself. I'm right-handed, so I'm on the left-hand side of the object, of the box. If I was left-handed, I would work on the right-hand side on the inside. So you want to pull the brush toward yourself and stop before you get to the line that goes another direction, and turn the paper so you can see where your brush is going. Go back into the edge that you didn't quite finish up with your brush tip. Pull your brush toward yourself, rotate it again, and it looks like I probably need to load my brush up, right? You want to have pigment on your brush. If it runs out, you need to pick up more. If you don't have more, you didn't make enough to start with. So make sure you start it off with what you need, so you don't have to stop and go back and remake that. If it dries while you're doing all this, it's harder to get nice even color coverage. So don't let it dry. You have to work kind of quick, right? But not so quick that you make a mess. And I don't need any more paint on my brush, probably. What I'm going to do is just pull around some of that pigment that was there when I did my outlining. There we go. I pulled a little bit more. Nice even coverage right up to the outlines. Now the next one, so that was hard edges and even color coverage. The next one is a high pigment and low water. That's pretty much what I did there, but I'm going to do even more mixing here, right? Maybe get a little bit more water into it, but I want to have less water and more pigment for this first one. That is at the left-hand side of the one we just did. The objectives are the same for everyone else. You're going to have solid, even color coverage, and you're going to have hard edges for all of these. So that's the first objective, right? So now we want to make these objectives come to life along with those. So once again, pull the brush toward yourself after you've mixed your color with water. And this one is supposed to be opaque for sure. No white paper showing through at all. That's why it has low water and high pigment. And we're doing wet on dry again, which means the paper is dry and the pigment is wet. And because of that, it takes a little bit more time to get the pigment onto the paper than with wet on wet, like we did with the pumpkin paintings we did last semester. Go right up to the edge as much as possible. Rotate your paper when you get to another line. Use the tip of your paintbrush to go into the corners and pull toward yourself. Notice I've got my hand resting on the table surface. That stabilizes my wrist so it's not shaky while I'm trying to paint. If you're hovering above it trying to paint it, it's going to be harder to control what you do. So I want to make sure this is nice and evenly covered with no white paper showing through. I go right up to the edges, make sure that I've got all of my outlines up to the line, up to black outline, and that's done. My next one is a medium pigment, which means less watercolor. The pigment itself is the color, the paint, and more water here. So we're going to have more water for each step, and we're not going to change the amount of pigment. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just kind of load this up with some water, and then I'm going to pull my liquidy part out of there. Try not to get messy like I was. I'm trying to go fast so I can do this all for you on this tape. So just unload it. Remember, you don't want to mess up your cakes of paint, and you don't want to take so much that you waste it. And then notice I'm tapping out my excess, right? I'm tapping it out so that I don't waste it over here. And now I get water, and I mix it in so that it's thinner than it was there. So it lets a little bit of the white paper show through, but it's still an even color coverage. So the white paper lightens it up and makes it look like what we call a tint of that color. A tint is when you add white to the pigment and you make it a lighter version of itself. So adding water to it lets more white paper show through because you have less color. Okay, so this should be able to do that first step after the opaque color. So we put it down the same way we did previously. Don't have too much in your brush. If you do, unload it here or here. And then you can control for going out of outlines and, going where you want to go with your brush. Remember to reload your brush as often as you need to so that it's a nice even color coverage. Though, like I said, the white paper should start to show through, but it shouldn't look like it's streaky. It shouldn't look like brush strokes. It should look even still, just with less pigment and more water. Gives you a tint of that color, whether it's orange like I'm doing, or blue, or violet, whatever your color is. Remember, I don't want you to use yellow or black for this because it's hard to do the work and see what you're doing. So that's a lighter version of the orange than that is. Now I'm going to take a little bit more water and add it right into this pot of color without adding more color. Okay, so I'm not taking pigment out of here. I'm putting water right in here. I don't need to add more pigment. I'm adding more water to lighten what pigment I do have to a lighter version of itself. And it's all kind of, I don't know the right word for this, but you have to kind of guess how much water you need to add to it. You can always try. If it looks too light, you can always add more pigment if you need to. If it needs more water, you can always add more water. This looks good to me. So I do my brush strokes the way I've been doing, right? And I let my water do the job at making a tint of this color. Generally, you don't get white watercolor in your trays, especially as beginning trays like this. You'll let your watercolor paper create the lighter versions of itself, as long as it's white paper. Okay, if isn't white paper, you're probably not going to be all that successful with watercolors anyway. Notice I didn't bother to outline this completely when I filled it in here, and that's okay. You know, any technique that you can develop to get hard edges is good with me. I just want to see that you've developed your skills to make that happen for you. I'm going to show you a technique with one of these paper towels that's at your table. I can tap out a little bit of that water and I can do what's called mopping, right? I can pull out a little bit of the stuff and then I can even it up on the paper like that, and that even lightens it up a little bit more. And it'll spread around and it'll even up if you've got enough water on there. My last one needs even more water. So instead of using the entire container or that entire pot of color, I'm going to go off to the side and do a little bit right here with lots of water and just a little pigment. Take it right there. And once again, this should let the white of the paper show through because you have more water and less pigment. Get those out of the way. And it still needs to be nice hard edges and evenly covered. Okay, so once again, rest your hand so you can keep those hard edges going. Pull it toward yourself as much as possible. If you adapt a style that makes those things happen for you that isn't on this sheet, I'm good with that. But this sheet is really good for anybody who's having difficulty getting hard edges. So now you can see there's a full range from opaque, starting here, to light. So this is a pure version of itself, and a little lighter, and a little lighter. So we've got an opaque to a transparent application of this color. So that's the scale. And of course, this one was to practice that technique, and these two look very much alike. All right. The next one, this should be labeled number 2, is to create 2 color value changes below by mixing colors on your palette here. This is your palette, right? This lid of your tray. By mixing the colors on the palette before painting them into the appropriate spaces. This is to continue the skills that you developed here, down here. So you still want hard edges, even color coverage. But on this one, you're going to do the wet on wet technique. So remember, you clean out your brush really well. Really well. Here's a good use for the paper towel again. Just all you need is one. Don't take a lot of them. Tap out the paint just to see that you've got all the color out of it, and then put your brush into the water, and then just paint water here. You're not painting color just yet, all right? And I want you to use the same color because you've already got some set up. Oops, looks like I still had some in that brush, right? I'm trying to go fast for you, and I'm not getting all of the skills developed that are done for myself that I want you to develop. So make sure that you do some cleaning really well. You're not trying to make a video for me. You're trying to do this appropriately for me, all right? So we're doing the pure color as much as possible. I've already got color there, but I probably should have a little bit more because I want it to be as pure as possible. If you need to mix up more color, do the color mixing first, and then do the water, and then get your paintbrush loaded up with the color. So now see how it kind of spreads it around. So when you did the water, you wanted to create those hard edges right up to the black outline, and it'll help to move it around for you onto the space much more quickly. You want to make sure you don't overload your brush, all right? Take out a little bit more of that and put a little more of that in. You don't want to overload your brush so it goes outside of your outlines before you're ready for it. I mean, you're not ever ready for it. Before you know it, is what I meant by that, right? Because it can happen, all right? There's the first one. It's as simple. It just moved it around. Now, this is going to be wet on dry like we did up here. And you're going to do the pure color once again. I'm going to mix up the color first, a little bit more of my color right here. Just have a pot of it that's a little purer. And this is wet on dry. So we're just practicing that technique once again. Okay? So a little bit more pigment. Notice that I tested it and I didn't like the results. So test it there. There we go. That's how much I want. So now while it's still wet, I want to go fast enough that I can create those hard edges without brush strokes showing. without going out of the outlines. Go right up to the outline there, pull it toward myself. So you're just reestablishing some of the skills you've already learned, but now you're focusing on it being wet on dry rather than the techniques that were the focus up above it. Okay, so notice how it took me a little longer to do the wet on dry, but the difference is the wet on wet, it kind of moves around so much that it pushes itself away, and it creates little peaks and valleys. So it's going to have some lighter areas and some darker areas, even though you don't want it to. All right, this is much more evenly applied because it soaks in evenly when you put it onto the paper. The last one here, we're going to mix a little black in with that color that's already there. I'm going to put a little bit more color there into this pot. Clean out my brush really well. Remember, when you do two colors, you want to clean your brush out so well that you don't see the first color in your brush at all. Even this much can be too much for any of these colors, especially if you do yellow. As you're doing the brush cleaning, I want to just show you this. Remember to tap out your brush like that with your hand shielding it so it doesn't splatter paint everywhere, all right? And then get some clean water just to hydrate your black a little bit. Black is a way to make shadows, shades. Shades are when you add black to a color, and the more black you add to the color, the darker it is. So we don't want to add a lot, but we want to have enough that we create a nice shade of whatever color you chose. And the darker ones like blue and purple are going to be harder, so you're going to need a little bit more black, but the lighter ones like orange and yellow, which you can't do for this sheet, by the way, it happens more subtle, more quickly. So you want to, when you do this, you want to mix it up really well. When I mix, just like when I pick up the paint, I rotate the brush in the area that I'm mixing it, whether it's here or there, and that rotating helps to distribute it evenly on the brush. And by doing it there, it also helps to distribute it evenly on the tray lid, which is our palette. Careful not to paint your palette because you'll waste your paint and then you won't have enough when you get to the square, all right? So keep it contained in one area if you can. And then the objectives are just the same. We're going to do wet on wet, so we clean off the brush really well. We apply water into that square, and then we take our shade of whatever color. I'm doing orange, the shade of orange. Tap it out, looks good. And I'll put water on the rectangle. Yeah, there we go. So this is wet on wet. The more water you put here, the less controlled it's going to be. So if you want it to be a little bit more controlled, don't put quite as much water on, and it won't puddle so much, it won't warp the paper so much that it does that puddling. And then tap out your excess water. I've got too much water in my brush for this color, so I want to get it dry. Please remember, never stroke your brush bristles, never take your paper towel and squeeze against it. Just tap it out. That destroys your brush bristles if you squeeze it out, okay? Pulls them out eventually from the ferrule, which is the silver part, which attaches it to the handle, which is where you control it. The process is the same, right? We've already got water here, so the water helps to move it around easily. Notice how it's just a subtle darkness of the orange, but it is a darker version of my orange. It's not what we call a pure color anymore, okay? Because it has been mixed with another color. Purposely mixed with another color, I should say, in this case. All right, so once again, you don't want to have it too wet. So if it's kind of wet like that and you don't like it to look like that, you can control for it a little bit by tapping out the excess in your brush already and dragging it back around while it's still wet. Once it starts to dry, stop, right? You don't want to do any work once it's dry because you can damage the work that you've already done, and you can also damage the paper by over brushing. So this, even though it lets a lot of the white paper show through with the watercolor wash, it's a darker version than any of these are. because it has black added to it. And that's how you create shades. If I wanted it to be even darker, I would just add more black to it, but I can't paint it. I don't want to paint it here, but that's how you make it a darker version of whatever color you want, is by mixing it and then painting it in place. You want to mix it on your palette first. Don't ever mix on your cakes. You'll never clean them up. It'll contaminate those colors and make them that color combination for forever. So do all your mixing here. Once this is dry, it gets turned in with the other ones in one package. So just let it sit and dry, and then when we're all done with the series of 6 worksheets, turn them in all together.